Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into how a foreign power literally rewired an entire island nation. We're exploring the history of Sri Lanka and looking at how deep structural changes by the British didn't just alter the economy, but actually forged a brand new, multi-layered national identity. Let's get right into it.
Here's how we're breaking it down today. We'll start with the foundations of colonial rule, shift into the massive pivot from coffee to tea, and then explore how that impacted labor and social classes. After that, we'll hit the educational revolution and finally look at the lasting cultural legacy and identity.
Part 1. Foundations of Colonial Rule.
Now, everything we're unpacking today is grounded in this fascinating academic paper by Joanna Nianaevska, titled Transformation of Identity in Sri Lanka Under the British Rule. It gives us a completely impartial historical lens to see exactly how these massive societal shifts unfolded layer by layer.
So, before the Europeans arrived, Sri Lanka was mostly defined by autonomous local kingdoms, like Kandy up in the Central Highlands and Jaffna in the north. Foreign influence? Well, it was a slow burn at first. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese showed up, testing the waters with trade and military outposts, experimenting with cinnamon and local spices. Then the Dutch took their turn. But the ultimate game changer? That was the British. By 1802, Ceylon became a British crown colony. It took a bit of time to get full control, but by 1815, the historically resilient Kandyan kingdom finally fell. And wow, this was a massive turning point. It brought the entire island under complete British rule for the very first time, essentially giving them a blank canvas to initiate some truly unprecedented changes.
Part 2. From coffee to tea.
All right, so once the British had total control, they kicked off these dramatic economic and topographical transformations that quite literally changed the physical shape of the island. The big catalyst here? The Colebrook-Cameron Commission. Under Governor Sir Robert Horton, these radical 19th century reforms basically blew the doors wide open for private enterprise. They deliberately tore down the old mercantilist systems, meaning they ended strict government control over trade and shut down state monopolies like the really famous one on cinnamon. This set the stage for a massive plantation economy. And to support all this new private business, they rolled out huge infrastructure projects, relying heavily on forced labor to literally hack new road systems straight through the dense island jungles.
500. Seriously, it is hard to overstate just how explosive this growth was. By the 1840s, there were over 500 distinct coffee plantations operating in Sri Lanka. We're talking about a massive, unprecedented coffee boom here. Entire mountainsides were completely cleared out to make way for this one cash crop. This was the initial engine for the island's modernization, yanking a traditionally agrarian society right into the fast current of global trade. The sheer scale and speed of it all, absolutely staggering. But then, a total, sudden crisis hit. A highly aggressive fungus just swept through the plantations and wiped out the coffee plants in a matter of 10 years. It was a devastating collapse of their main economic engine. But honestly, the recovery was astonishingly fast. Planters didn't just try to replace the coffee, they aggressively pivoted straight to tea. And tea cultivation? It absolutely exploded. Just imagine the topography of an entire nation being physically altered. The British eventually blanketed over 2 million acres of the hill country in vibrant green tea plants. It rendered coffee cultivation completely obsolete and totally transformed the ecological landscape of Ceylon's highlands.
Now, you can't have an agricultural shift of this massive magnitude without an entirely new level of infrastructure, right? You simply cannot move millions of acres worth of tea and all the labor required to harvest it without major transportation. So this led to the creation of early railway networks, specifically engineered to navigate those steep, treacherous hills. The very first main line was a 54-kilometer stretch connecting Colombo on the coast all the way to Mbapusa. It was a massive engineering feat designed strictly for economic extraction and logistical support. And what's kind of wild is that these exact same railway lines built over a century ago to extract crops are the very same lines tourists famously ride today to see the hill country.
Part 3. Labor and social stratification. So, we've talked about the land and the crops, but we absolutely have to look at the deeply human element of this shift. Because unlike coffee, tea needs to be harvested continuously, all year round. And that demands a massive permanent labor force. To pull this off, vast waves of Indian Tamil migrant laborers were brought in to settle on these high-altitude estates. The source material points out a really stark, sobering reality of this boom, noting that these workers endured abominable working conditions and squalid housing. It's a heavy human cost that we really have to acknowledge. This immense migration rapidly changed the island's demographics. These migrant laborers soon made up a full 10% of the entire population, fundamentally shifting village structures and social dynamics forever.
And the ripples of this new capitalist economy?
They extended much farther up the social ladder, birthing entirely new commercial classes. Almost overnight, you have this rise of influential landowners, wealthy planters, transport agents, contractors, and businessmen. It created a new, highly anglicized, conservative elite class, and this was a huge shock to the system. Suddenly, the traditional Kandyan aristocratic chiefs and headmen, families who had held undisputed local power for literally centuries, found themselves competing directly with these new commercial groups for the favor of the British government. The entire social pyramid of the island was basically being redrawn from scratch.
Part 4. The Educational Revolution. Okay, so this rapidly expanding, heavily stratified society needed administrative, legal, and medical professionals to keep it running, and that triggered a massive overhaul of how people actually learned in Sri Lanka. We can trace this evolution in 3 clear steps. Historically, education was handled by traditional Buddhist monastic convents, teaching religion, logic, and indigenous medicine. To jump from that deeply traditional system to a Western-style, government-subsidized model, that was a massive cultural whiplash. In 1870, the government expanded state-run schools and started heavily subsidizing private English medium schools, fundamentally centralizing education. Finally, after a long push by the university movement, this culminated in the opening of the University of Ceylon in 1942. That paved the way for a system where, eventually, all levels of national education became free of charge.
But we have to understand this new system was deeply and intentionally stratified. Just look at the 1870 dual-track system. On one hand, you had private schools, mostly run by Christian organizations, teaching exclusively in English. This track was explicitly targeted at an elite male clientele destined for high-level administrative positions. English rapidly became the absolute primary road to social advancement and political power. On the flip side, you had government schools teaching in Tamil and Sinhala. These functioned as elementary education aimed simply at promoting universal literacy for the rural populations. It was a really stark educational divide that effectively cemented a person's social status right from childhood.
Part 5. Cultural Legacy and Identity.
So how did all of these immense economic, demographic, and educational shifts leave their lasting cultural imprint on the island? Well, the adoption of British cultural customs was highly strategic and incredibly pervasive among the new elite. Even today, the highest-situated city, Nuwara Eliua, serves as this fascinating colonial time capsule. The British equipped these mountain retreats with their own architecture, lush manicured gardens, racetracks, and golf facilities. It's actually a bit surreal to think about. They were so determined to recreate home that they introduced the cultivation of cold-weather crops like strawberries and even brought in trout for sport fishing right in the middle of a tropical South Asian island. And, of course, they left behind one of their most indelible cultural possessions, a massive, lasting passion for cricket.
As Sri Lanka approached its 1948 independence, the legacy of British rule was this deeply complex duality. On the positive side, they undeniably established a modernized, globally relevant agricultural export economy through those massive tea and rubber plantations, along with a railway system that still connects remote rural highlands to urban coastal ports today. But the negative side of that exact same coin is that the British placed literally zero value on industrializing Sri Lanka. They didn't build factories. They didn't build robust manufacturing sectors. They left the island completely one-sidedly aligned with agriculture. Why does that matter? Well, because if global tea or rubber prices dropped, the entire country's economy crashes. They had no industrial base to fall back on, leaving the newly independent nation incredibly vulnerable to the fierce fluctuations of global commodity markets.
Which leaves us with this final, profound question. How does a nation defined by continuous foreign influence, completely restructured social classes, and immense economic vulnerability forge its own independent identity in the modern era? The endless green tea fields and the historic railway lines still draw tourists from around the world today, but they are also the literal roots of a complex, multi-layered Sri Lankan national identity that is still actively defining itself right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this structured look at history gave you a much deeper understanding of the profound forces that shape nations. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.